The Trump administration moves to repeal the so-called endangerment finding, which is a linchpin of regulations of federal greenhouse gas emissions. Meantime, the Energy Department releases a report with a new view of climate change from the federal government.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The endangerment finding is what underlies a lot of federal regulations of greenhouse gas emissions. But the Environmental Protection Agency is now moving to undo that. Let's listen to Energy Secretary Chris Wright discussing that this week.
When I heard the endangerment finding announcement 17 years ago, that they had found, as someone who's already involved in the climate discussion, was already involved in the energy world, clearly they didn't look at the data, they didn't understand climate change, they didn't appreciate how energy works. But this ruling happened, and it happened because they couldn't do it through the House and the Senate and the presidency, the normal lawmaking process. They found a backdoor way to take away your freedom and to make your life more expensive and shrink your life opportunities.
Alicia, give us some of the background here. What is this endangerment finding, and why is it so important to a lot of the regulations that have taken place over those past 17 years in Washington?
So this endangerment finding goes back to a 2007 Supreme Court case in which you had many Democratic states sued actually the Bush administration and claimed that the EPA must regulate greenhouse gas emissions because they are a pollutant that endangers the public health and welfare. Now, the Clean Air Act only gives express authority to the EPA to regulate what are known as 6 criteria pollutants. And these are things that clearly do harm human health, can make you sick. And for instance, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, ozone. These have direct effects on human health. Now, what the Supreme Court ruled was, well, okay, but we're going to order the EPA. They have an obligation to review all the evidence and nonetheless to consider whether greenhouse gas emissions, which the justices deemed an air pollutant under a very broad, capacious interpretation of the law, endangers human health and welfare. And not surprisingly, the Obama administration came back in 2009 and said, well, we do think that greenhouse gas emissions endanger human health and welfare. And they provided a ream of cherry-picked studies that claim, well, the greenhouse gas emissions through indirect effects increase global warming and can affect the climate, and that therefore can harm human health, safety, rising sea levels, higher temperatures can increase perhaps allergies and spread of diseases, even though there's a lot of uncertainty about these claims. And for the most part, they really haven't been borne out by more rigorous studies. And so this 2009 endangerment finding therefore provided the pretext for the EPA to go in and regulate greenhouse gas emissions across the entire economy. Now, the Obama administration focused more on the vehicle tailpipe emissions, so to restrict or limit how much CO2 can be emitted by cars. And this ended up becoming essentially a backdoor EV mandate that was begun under Obama and continued under Biden. What it also did was it embarked on its Clean Power Plan that effectively intended or effectively forced coal and natural gas plants to shut down because they didn't meet the greenhouse gas emission standards for power plants. And the other kind of kink in this rule was that it would have required these fossil fuel plants to subsidize renewable plants. Now, recall that the Supreme Court eventually ruled in 2022 that the Clean Power Plant under Obama was unlawful, that the EPA didn't even have the authority to do it, but they didn't address this broader question of of whether EPA even has the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And so now with the Trump EPA, Lee Zeldin, is coming out and saying, no, we actually don't think we do have the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions.
To underline that point, this is some of the language that the Supreme Court was looking at in the Clean Air Act in that Massachusetts VPA ruling. It says that the EPA shall regulate any emissions of any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles, which in the EPA administrator's judgment shall contribute to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. So the two questions here, Kim. First, the Supreme Court said in that 5-4 decision that the Clean Air Act and that language does apply to greenhouse gases that may be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. And then the EPA, as Alicia describes, went back and found that endangerment was in fact happening. But part of the argument here is that this is not a pollutant in the way that Congress might have been thinking about that when it passed the Clean Air Act initially. Greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, are not things that get spewed out into the air and you breathe them in and they make you sick. And so I assume that that's part of the argument from the Trump administration here, is that we are going back to what we think was originally meant by Congress and these lawmakers when they passed the Clean Air Act in the first place.
Something to know about that 2007 decision that Alicia referenced, which is that it was a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court, a very close run thing. And this was a very different court that made the decision. I mean, this was back in the days with swing votes of Anthony Kennedy, et cetera. And it was deeply criticized because if you actually read the clear text of the Clean Air Act, there is no mention of greenhouse gases. So this was very much the court saying, well, we're going to take the kind of living statute approach here and just now say it's okay to also include this, when in reality, those of us out there always argued, if Congress really believed something, an issue this large, was something that Congress wants to have addressed via the Clean Air Act or by a new statute, it should have to pass legislation. But that's what ended up happening. Now, of course, remember, we've got a very, very different court these days. And that's crucial to the argument that the Zeldin court, the Zeldin EPA is making, is that under the new majority that we've had, they have talked a lot about, for instance, the major questions doctrine, and this argument that you can't go hiding, elephants in mouse holes, and that if Congress didn't specifically say something, then most likely the bureaucrats do not have the authority. And so that's the fundamental rationale that Zeldin used as he put this out and said, under our judgment, looking again at more recent Supreme Court findings and rulings, we don't think that we actually have the authority to go this far. Because one other thing I just want to clarify, because it's very confusing to a lot of people and it's deliberate on behalf of climate activists, is they like to make it sound as though greenhouse gases are pollution, and they're not. There is nothing wrong with CO2. It does not cause health problems, as Alicia noted. It's a very different category of everything else that is regulated under the Clean Air Act. And in fact, just a funny thing, to a certain extent, to the degree that we have those other pollutants and they create, for instance, things like smog, which CO2 does not do, scientists actually believe that smog has interestingly, a cooling effect on the planet to a certain degree. Not that we should want more of it, but what I am saying is that actual pollution is not contributing to global warming.
Alicia, on the point of the legal lay of the land here, I've seen some skeptics, and not on the left, but on the right, saying that because there is this record of a decade and a half of the EPA talking about the endangerment of climate change, that any attempt to reverse that by the Trump administration might get tangled up in the courts. What do you make of that objection to this? And should this be, is there going to be an opportunity maybe for the Supreme Court at some point to take another look at that 5-4 Massachusetts v. EPA ruling, and another consideration with new, more originalist textualist justices to consider what a pollutant under the Clean Air Act actually is.
Right. So I think that the Trump administration is hoping to tee this up, Massachusetts v. EPA, to tee this up, to reconsider whether the EPA even has authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as pollutants. And to Kim's point, this would seem to be a major questions that should be left for Congress. Now, what I would expect to happen is I expect the Democratic states, maybe some climate groups, will sue and challenge the EPA once Administrator Zeldin comes out with the final rescinding the endangerment finding. And then there's going to be a couple questions here. One, do those Democratic and climate groups even have legal standing to sue in federal court? I raise that because actually at the Supreme Court in the Massachusetts v. EPA case, you had the conservatives hold that the Democratic states didn't have standing to challenge the EPA's failure to regulate. So courts could actually just hold that, well, these states don't even have standing to sue, or climate groups don't have standing to sue because they haven't been directly harmed by the rescission of this endangerment finding. So that's one possibility. Now, the other possibility is they find that they do, or the federal courts, lower courts do, and then this kicks it up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court now, well, they may also revisit that standing question, but they also have an opportunity to revisit this Massachusetts v. EPA decision and extend their major questions doctrine here. And why I think is really important to recall and remember is that Democrats in Congress in 2009 did seek to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. There was a cap and trade program that they were trying to pass. It passed the House. It died in the Senate, as it turns out, because there was opposition from Democrats at the time in the Senate, blue dog Democrats, from states like Arkansas, Indiana, who didn't want to walk that plank. And you had the famous Joe Manchin ad in 2010, vowing that he'd shoot the cap and trade bill. And so this is relevant because it shows that this really is a question that Congress should and did attempt to address. They just didn't have the political support to do it at the time. And what the Obama administration did is they basically did an end run around Congress.
Meantime, this week, the Energy Department also released a report on climate change. It is titled A Critical Review of Impacts of Greenhouse Gas Emissions on the U.S. Climate, written by 5 PhDs. And Kim, this is part of what you talk about in your column on Friday under the headline, The Rise of the Climate Right. And later you talk about Energy Secretary Chris Wright rallying the nascent climate right. So give us a sense of what do you mean by what is the climate right?
Well, this report, just to put this in context, I think is really important because it actually goes hand in hand with what the EPA did. That's why they were released simultaneously. If the EPA ruling the rescission of the endangerment finding was essentially taking away the legal authority of the federal government to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant, this report was seeking to reframe the science that the federal government has depended on under the Obama and Biden administrations as a justification to take the very extreme steps that they did. And Chris Wright's complaint has been that a lot of that data was cherry-picked to just show worst-case scenarios, and that one problem is that the American public has not really heard the truth about the totality of climate science, which is that it's deeply unsettled. There are so many questions that we don't really have answers to. And this media narrative that you hear constant, this drumbeat in the New York Times and elsewhere that we're headed toward a doomsday catastrophe scenario is not justified if you actually even look at the IPCC reports and other things. If you go look at the data, it shows much more profoundly that uncertainty and the big questions and the variations that are out there. And the reason I think this is important politically That's a question of policy, the report itself. And it's a good report. I do suggest people read it. But politically, if you look back over the history of the last 30 or 40 years, the conservative movement has somewhat struggled about how to handle these climate wars. And for a long time, they simply rejected the argument that the Earth was warming, and thus leading to the term climate denier. Obviously, as the planet has warmed some, that's been a harder position to hold. And so then they kind of moved to trying to say this is just too expensive for us to do, and attacking the Democrats on that part. That was, in fact, played a huge role in it being shot down in the Senate back in 2009, the episode, and in 2010, the episode Alicia was talking about. It was effective political strategy, but not a long-term one, because as this narrative has grown, this incomplete narrative, mostly by the press and activists, people became more and more worried about this. And this marks the first time, I would argue, that you've had an elected leader and an administration that's now willing to completely go toe-to-toe with the left, instead on the science, and to say, yes, our climate is changing. Nobody is denying that. And if you read the report, it makes it very clear. But here's all the stuff that you guys have not heard yet, and it is not part of the debate that needs to be. For instance, that there are aspects of global warming that are beneficial, including to agricultural production, that we still do not know yet the extent to which humans play a role in climate change, that our models are all over the map. And the fact that we can't get agreement on them is kind of concerning, because it means we're doing a lot of guesswork, that climate change has not had much of an economic impact, nor is it expected to have much of an economic impact. And I think this is an important one, that even if the United States takes drastic climate policy action, it will have a negligible or no effect in global climate questions. So reports out there, but I just think both from a policy perspective and a political perspective, this marked a little bit of a moment.
This report is quite in the weeds on some of these questions about uncertainty in climate modeling. It talks about the changing pH of ocean water, for example, often called ocean acidification. They take issue with that term. But notable, this is a section from the foreword by the Energy Secretary. He writes, "Climate change is real and it deserves attention, but it is not the greatest threat facing humanity. That distinction belongs to global energy poverty." He goes on to say, "Climate change is a challenge, not a catastrophe, but misguided policies based on fear rather than facts could truly endanger human well-being," unquote. Alicia, I guess my read of this is the report will be taken for what it is. I mean, government agencies often issue reports. People can read them or not read them. They can have that effect. But it is an interesting statement about the Energy Secretary and the U.S. government's view, potentially, of its policy and its approach toward these issues. Again, emphasizing in the Energy Secretary's view that climate change is real and it is a challenge, but it is one that does not necessitate some of the policy changes that have been pushed in recent years, and particularly the idea in some quarters that the response to climate change needs to be pushing back people's standard of living by maybe years or decades.
Well, I think all that's right. The Trump administration really wants to focus on improving standards of living. And the best way in the US and abroad, and the best way to do that is probably to unleash natural gas, cheap natural gas, and boost production. That's also, by the way, if you really care about climate change, that's the least expensive, most technologically feasible way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But to the broader point, the cold kills many more people than hot weather does. And so providing cheap sources of fuel will reduce the number of deaths. And not only that, providing more cheap, abundant energy will allow the more electrification. And when I mean electrification, there are many people in sub-Saharan, Africa and very poor areas of the world that still don't actually have a connection to electricity. And so, therefore, forget about air conditioning or any, many sanitation. Sanitation requires electricity too. By connecting these people to the grid, and the easiest way to do that is with fossil fuels, not by building huge solar plants that can't run at all hours of the day. By expanding fossil fuel production, you're actually helping to improve living standards in many places of the world that are currently very poor and suffering diseases and other results of that poverty. Now, back in the US, what you've been seeing is that energy or electricity prices in particular have been increasing over the last 4 or 5 years as a result of the administration's policies to promote solar, wind, batteries, notwithstanding all these subsidies going into those areas, that electricity prices have been increasing. And as a result, you're actually having people, one, fall behind on their utility payments, and two, having to swelter in the heat during heat waves and cut back on their consumption because of the rising prices. And this really, by the way, threatens to erode living standards, but also U.S. economic growth and manufacturing activity, because one of the largest inputs or largest costs for manufacturers is
The other thing that always strikes me about the politics around this, Kim, is I don't doubt the sincerity of some of the activists who are saying that climate change is a real serious threat, needs to be taken more seriously, Al Gore and whatnot. But even after years and decades of that drumbeat, they have not convinced the public of that, or at least to take on added costs to their day-to-day budgets to do that. And you see that whenever there are referendums, votes, ballot initiatives on climate taxes, green taxes, carbon fees, and whatnot, even in pretty blue jurisdictions in the Pacific Northwest and stuff, those things seem to go down by pretty significant margins. There must be people in those states who are voting blue and voting for Democrats for governor, because those are the politicians who are running those states, and are nevertheless coming out to the ballot box to oppose those kinds of measures that would add costs to their daily budget and make their lives more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, if you want a case study in consumer rejection of more full-scale greenhouse gas reduction policies, look to Europe at the moment, where the politicians that have made energy production there extremely expensive and unstable are getting a lot of backlash over their ambitions that they have put into effect in recent years. And I think it's a good warning for here in the United States. We've had a couple of our own warnings. Alicia has written brilliantly about some of the blackouts we've seen and grid instability, a lot of which has come from poorly thought through renewable energy projects, et cetera, in places like Texas and elsewhere. And we were headed toward a situation like Europe, which is under the Biden administration, which is why I think it's so important. This Trump administration has not been shy about saying, look, we need to care about resilience. We need to care about stability. We need to care about affordable energy. Chris Wright, who you mentioned, and Alicia was talking about, and global energy poverty. This was a mission of his for much of his adult life. He's had a nonprofit devoted to this that he ran via his company, Liberty Energy, before he came to be the Department of Energy Secretary, and just talking about all of the problems that so many average people around the globe face because of a lack of any affordable energy out there. And this gets to the bigger point, too, about the problems of this narrative, which is that they tend to warp the discussion and then make it harder for us to have good priorities in policymaking and decision. And it's just very important that people start to push back, because in recent years, especially under the Biden administration, I mean, it's almost become absurd, the level of manipulated and distorted and incorrect climate reporting out there that is providing this scary scenario that is simply not supported by what we know at all. And that message needs to get out to more Americans. And this was a good.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.